So should I just start, or are you introducing yourself?
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to manage the YouTube connection.
I see.
I will.
She will definitely introduce you.
Okay, good. Sorry.
No, we are sorry. We should have told you
Yes,
that.
I am sorry. I will introduce you, and then you can start your presentation. So, welcome all, as a more formal welcome. I am very pleased to introduce Professor Katja Grillner as the first guest of our FADA Talk series around design research. Katja Grillner is professor in critical studies in architecture and head of department at the School of Architecture at KTH. Her research into architecture and landscape perform aesthetic, historical, and literary investigations from the perspectives of poetic practices and critical theory. In her teaching, she has, together with her colleagues, contributed to a presence of courses or course components concerning intersections between architecture, feminism, and gender in architecture program and in extracurricular courses at school. Grillner has initiated and participated in the formation of several groups and contexts that has had an impact on development of architecture and design research in Sweden, the Academy for Practice-Based Research in Architecture and Design, Feminist Architecture Theory, Analysis and Education, and their strong research environment, Architecture in Effect. Her presentation today, called Design Research in Architecture, Situating, Thought, Projecting Action, introduces examples from and around her work practices as researcher, educator, and academic leader. The lecture will discuss and suggest ways to further a critically transformative design research practice. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are looking forward to hear it from you. I will leave it from you, hear from you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really nice, fantastic to be with you tonight, in spite of us being in all these different locations. Thank you so much for the invitation, and also for the invitation to talk about design research. I will share my screen. I think it's probably easiest because the presentation I give together today is like a formal lecture, so it's probably easiest if we have a question and answer session at the end. But also, I mean, if there are things like technical, if there are things like we are not hearing you properly, please tell me so that I don't talk without you hearing properly.
Okay, your screen and voice is all clear, so we can have the questions and answers at the end. Yeah, good. But if there is anything like you feel urgently you need to interrupt, just do that. But otherwise, I think it's easier to have like discussion, reflections, questions afterwards. Okay, so. And I will also, in the end, this lecture is in large bits based on a book chapter that I have written. So I will also give a reference to this book chapter. So in the end, if you want to revisit the thoughts or go follow up the references, and so you will also be able to do that. So I will give you these references. Okay, so design research in architecture, situating thought, projecting action. Design is not just a building, an interior, or a preserved landscape. It is a means of acting in and transforming the world. If this statement is embraced, as it was uttered by Michael Speaks in 2012, Michael Speaks, who is, among other things, well known for his advocacy in the early 2000s of a post-critical stance, and for doing away with critical theory at large. If this statement is embraced, it is interesting to ask what happens if the same argument is put forward for design research. Can research too
be a means of acting in and transforming the world. That seems to be very much the case. In fact, it is in most circles what is expected nowadays. In order to receive funding, with few exceptions, whether public or private, strong arguments must be made about the acute relevance of the research project in the light of societal impact and direct or at least long-term applicability. From a more theoretical standpoint, however, the direct link between research to action is neither self-evident nor unproblematic. What is at stake when boundaries are blurred between academy and industry, researcher and designer, or activist, for that matter? In the area between pure research, as it were, the comfortable ivory tower position, and research as product, direct innovation, product development, buildings, or even urban planning and design interventions. In between these positions, we find a plethora of both critical and much less critical agents and positions. From political activists to pragmatic reformers to curious inventors to clever advocates for a radical commercialization of the university world, they all believe in some way or another that knowledge development both can and should be put to use, and that the direct link between research and actual transformation of the world is important, or put in another way, profitable. And I will take an example here from the Swedish funding agency for research. The Swedish government agency, Vinnova, it's a state funding agency, which is funding research and innovation projects with around, this is in British pounds, the figure 200 million British pounds per year. They are, for example, explicitly stating that its top priority is to support research and development projects that are likely to promote and expand Swedish industry and export. Okay, this is a special funding agency that is geared towards innovation. So it's not the, we also have the research funding agencies that are more for basic research. But the project should be likely to promote and expand Swedish industry and export. This is a very direct link then, research and benefits. Advanced visionary research on innovation systems in sustainable environmental planning and design is thus only interesting if it's backed up by competitive and commercially successful Swedish industry. I'm drawing this a bit provocatively here, but one can read the statutes as is. This construction reflects directly on the agency's government mission and has a simple and understandable logic, but it does at the same time place a researcher in an ethically tricky situation. For whom does one work? What controls the decisions on where the greatest potentiality for furthering a sustainable societal development, as an example, where it lies, and how does this steer the nature of both the resulting knowledge and developed applications? So the lecture here was framed by some quite intense conversations on these matters that were had both in the Swedish research context, but also as I was invited together with other Scandinavian researchers to a session held by Michael Speaks, who I'm citing here, which was talking explicitly then in the US context about the university-industry relations and how we can work with that creatively, but also importantly in a critical way and kind of keep the criticality of the academic context. So the lecture here was partially provoked by such conversations, and also by a realization that further qualifications has to be articulated to differentiate positions, ambitions, and aims of different kinds within the growing design research field in architecture, and engagement in these epistemological questions that are also provoked. So here, with the assistance of Christopher Freyling's now classic differentiation between research in 2, through, and 4 design, I hope to outline a structured starting point to further qualify the debate. And following this, by introducing examples from and around my own practice as educator and researcher, I hope to suggest ways in which I believe it should be possible to further critically transformative design research practice. To embrace the necessity of acting in and transforming the world, while at the same time saving in the academy always a spot for a kind of ivory tower, however temporary or fragile its construction may be, and however much the researcher must run up and down the ladder to gain alternative viewpoints of the problem at hand. Research, science, scholarship. Research is, after all, nothing if we do not in some way change ourselves as well as our buildings. The best architectural research is therefore that which asks us to consider not only what we understand and undertake by way of architecture and buildings, but also who we think we are and how we want to reside, play, and work together. So Christopher Freyling's distinctions between research in 2, through, and 4 design is an adaptation of Herbert Reed's analysis of fine arts teaching and begins at the end of research for art, which can be understood as a realm of the romantic artist, research for art, which can be understood as a realm of the romantic artist genius for whom nothing but the work in itself matters in the end. Freyling cites Picasso claiming that to search means nothing in painting. To find is the thing. So research for art or design or architecture is to be understood as a process of exploration, discovery, and fact-finding that makes it possible to produce a particular work. This process can be both careful, systematic, and deep, as well as spontaneous, associative, and serendipitous. But the journey, to use a common metaphor for a research process, is in itself not of the interest to the artist or designer at work, and there is no systematic analysis or documentation that takes care of the knowledge spills that is bound to come out on the way. So research for art, design, and architecture is the kind of research that you would produce in a studio setting, working on your design project. You're kind of developing lots of knowledge in order to be able to produce the design. But the knowledge that you produce is not actually the point here. The point is the design that you are developing. Christopher Freyling spends a lot of time in his analysis on mapping stereotypical perceptions of artists, designer, and scientists to, in the end, point to their fallacies and how they relate to the present concern with how to understand research in relation to artistic practice. Historical examples such as Da Vinci and Constable counter the position of Picasso, as they in their respective time contributed directly through artistic methods of observation and documentation to the development of knowledge on, for example, anatomy, physiology, or meteorology. With Da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, we know the anatomical drawings, and with John Constable, he did all these paintings of cloud and cloud formations, and that also kind of actually brought insights into meteorology. So there we have examples of research through art. So, and the objective there is actually research. It is to understand more about cloud formation, to use artistic methods to actually, and painting and skills of observation to understand more about clouds. So the objective is research, and artistic methods, perception, and ambitions provide the means. And now we are almost, as you can see, this text is from 93, so we're almost getting 30 years after this essay, and it's still actually like providing very fundamental concepts for us. We are looking into the now rather substantial portfolio of world of design-driven research or practice-led, both MPhil or PhD projects. And we find there a wide range of examples in between the research for art design architecture and through art design architecture. You will find these different positions. And for myself, the research that I've done that are more into the design, the practice-based research, it also finds itself sort of in between these positions. The third category, research into art, design, architecture, is perhaps the easiest to comprehend and remember. Here we have a clear outsider perspective. The researcher launches an investigation into art, architecture, design, or particular aspects of its practice, its artifacts or its effects. And then we recourse to established research methodologies from, for example, the humanities, social sciences, or natural sciences. A design researcher gets by very well on this arena. So in the first two, the research for and through, it is assumed that engaged researchers have access to or personal experience from methods unique to their own design practice. In this third category, it's not necessary that the actually practicing researcher is a designer or artist. Often it has not been the case. If we take art history as the most clear example. So one might argue that here we do have research with a capital R, as you see in the presentation, as a kind of long research. The architecture research here has a very long history because it goes together with art history research and very on traditional methods. While the design research and design research classifying and being discussed as academic research has a much younger history. The history of research into art, design, architecture, for example, in the late 19th century, we had Wolflin working very clearly with this documentation of art historical facts, artifacts. And it's also very possible to argue the opposite then, actually, that in relation to much longer history of design-based knowledge development in these fields, and that this actually, the design-based knowledge development, is what is articulated in the long history of architectural treatises, where we would have, for example, the Renaissance treatises, or even Vitruvius going back and so forth. There we have a documentation of design-based architectural knowledge. But in kind of conventional idea of academic research, the tradition of research into art, design, architecture is longer. Okay, so this was quite a long excursion into kind of fundamentals of design research distinctions. So of what use are these distinctions to qualify the discussion that was opened up in the beginning here on the possible mission or responsibility for design research to transform the world? The three positions differentiates expectations on the relationship between the design outcome, whether a product, prototype, architectural project, building, urban development scenario, planning document, etc., and the knowledge development. So the design outcome and the knowledge development, what's the relation? In the first case, knowledge is seen to develop within the process, but no effort is made to articulate that gain or to spread it beyond the directly involved parties. In both the second and the third case, knowledge development is considered explicit and expected to be clearly articulated in the course of the research process. So Freiling's distinctions between, sorry, I lost my way. The research outcome in either of the two positions is generally not identical to a design outcome. In research through design, however, design outcomes from the research process are usually presented as integrated part of the research outcome, while research into would generally not include such a component. So, transforming the world then, in what direction, for whom, and to what purpose? I am a passionate advocate for interdisciplinary research because to truly engage in such work is often a difficult and transformational experience, combining critical engagement with the emergence of new forms of knowledge that are not yet classifiable. Interpreting the mission to transform the world quite boldly, we imagine innovations or interventions that succeeds in changing an important aspect of life or living in this world. The effects may be local or global in scale, but they need to address a broader community and have a sustained impact to qualify as real transformation. How and where does such things happen? In politics, in industry, in community actions, in science and technology, and more. For a research project to do this in a direct way, that is simply not simply producing knowledge that in the next step can be put into use by other agents. So to do this in a direct way, the project clearly needs to get involved on the ground and perform research at the same time as it transforms, teaming up or collaborating with external partners, and constituting as such what we call an action research project. For our purposes here, particular interest is to understand whether or how such a project produces something that can be communicated as a research outcome, and whether it's performed through design or based on an inquiry into design or both. Technically, following Freiling's distinctions, this is what legitimates the project as a proper research project rather than simply a project involving research. Jane Rendell's article, Architectural Research and Disciplinarity from 2004, moves beyond Freiling's category of through design by emphasizing on one hand the potential for interdisciplinary intersections through a complex architectural design inquiry, and on the other, how this condition places architectural research in a particular position due to its potential to engender new forms of knowledge and to address a wide range of critical questions for politics and society at large. And this qualification is important. Design research engaging directly in architectural analysis, interpretation, alteration, and design does not only hold the capacity to develop knowledge and applications in direct relation to an articulated design problem, but it further holds the potential to structure an investigation which by means of architectural design methods explores research questions that reaches far beyond the scope of the eventual design applications. In the article Practice-Based Research in Architecture and Design, I, together with Lars-Henrik Ståhl, identified this characteristic as a typical feature of the studio tradition in architecture schools. That is a critical framing of design projects through larger societal or philosophical concerns. But we also noted that typically this methodology appeared to be lost in the transition from studio to PhD-based research. Now, this was a long time ago, 15 years later, the situation has somewhat changed, but we're still facing these challenges where we see a really rich potential for research in our studio activities. But this is quite tricky to translate on then to the continued research on PhD levels. So the discussion so far has not engaged in specific matters now, but more in general distinctions and conceptual definitions. And in reality, very few projects are as simple to classify as what is being implied, but if we look at this distinctions by Christopher Freiling. Of course, in the absence of examples, we have no idea what really could be at stake here. In what direction, for whom, and to what purpose might these potential design research projects transform the world? Feminist alterations. The altering practices are named after the process they induce, by what they do. They rely on the transformative power of altering on both its positive and critical dynamics. In the syntagm altering practices, altering could mean undermining, subverting received identities and authoritative rules, norms, and tools, working out other shared meanings throughout the transformation. The altering practices are about what we want the world to become. Donna Petrescu in 2007. In 2007, I, together with 4 of my colleagues at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, School of Architecture, formed the Feminist Architecture group, FATALE. Our ambition was to transform architecture, the discipline, profession, and its spatial articulations through research, education, and practice. Among other things, the group quickly established new elective courses and a design studio on master level that offered feminist design tools and perspectives. And I can just mention as a side this morning, I taught one of these courses that is still going strong on feminist writing. So we have 2 of these elective courses on architecture and gender that we were still running as part of a broader curriculum. So altering practices here was both the title of the last studio course in the 4th year that we had in the critical design studio. And it also stood for a critical reflexive position that is activated from the start and ran through the core of our teaching practice. This notion was developed in the publication Altering Practices as described in this quotation by Doina Petrescu. And it's driven by a central question: what do we want the world to become? And this became very important for the Critical Studies Design Studio, which we developed by FATALE, and which then ran on for several years and developed further. So this is one of the examples here. The Critical Studies Design Studio that we developed engaged in design and research in an integrated way, looking at architectural design projects as producers of knowledge and instigators of change. In our projects, we frequently returned to questions such as, what knowledge have we gained here? How will this project alter the conditions right here? Who may benefit from this change? Who might not? And research in the studio was pursued both as an individual portfolio of design projects was built, and collectively as we tested out and developed new critical design methods in collaboration. A series of research and methodology seminars supported this aspect of the studio, which through selected readings and assignments worked to clarify individual design and research questions, programs, methodologies, and concepts. And students were required to make connection between the work and the effect it may have outside the academic environment, raising questions about social responsibility through architectural means. And by combining resources between this design studio and the selective courses that I just told you about that we're still running, such as a lecture series, experimental writing, and studio courses with international guests, we could provide then opportunities for a vital exchange amongst participants with various backgrounds. So students would come both from the master studio level, but also from the continuing education. So you would get experienced artists, journalists, and so forth joining up. Our student projects range from complex building design to landscape and urban redevelopment, to small-scale design interventions, performance pieces, to complex mapping and cataloging schemes. And FATALE also, we worked as a spatial practice and worked with the arrangement of conversational spaces in the format of what we call performance salons. That is event that could be viewed as seminars, as workshops, as social events, gatherings around particular issues in which hosts and guests were kind of co-producing space through spatial arrangement and performance. And you see some images here from some such events. So conversations, clothings, bodies, posture, and relational engagement are all part of this. And 3 examples of this are Anthology Works from 2009, Shifting Perspectives 2010, and the Incompatible Modalities Salon at 2010 at the Woburn Studios in London. And this is the image to the upper right is from this Incompatible Modalities Salon, and I will talk a little bit more about that. For the 2010 conference, Irigaray conference, Sexual Subjects, Politics, Poetics and Ethics at UCL in London, And in relation to a session that was called the Whirlwinds session, that was exposing different critical design research work, FATALE invited participants to the Incompatible Modalities Salon. We were providing lunch and a space for critical reflection for the conference participants, and shaped a conversational garden around 10 fluttering follies, each with a different modality of chicks, birds, and buildings. These follies were called such names as the Love Nest, La Sibylle, the Grotto. There were also a distinct soundtrack, projected images, and picnic spots articulated around these follies. What each participant brought to the scene, such as clothing, actions, topics, added to this formation. And in this, FATALE performed a guided tour, and this is what you're seeing in the image here. You're seeing a guided tour of the garden that was performed at this lunch hour. We articulated the arranged garden through these gendered connotations, the feminist narratives and figurations that were materialized in these follies, and made a kind of momentary realization of a critical fiction. The format of the Salon provided critical potential to transform through enactment and arrangement an institutionally and architecturally framed environment in a number of ways. The Incompatible Modalities Salon explores the specific spatial and social condition. What can it mean to be productive of, and what can be argued to be a spatial modality of an essentially incompatible alternative kind? This title, the Incompatible Modalities Salon, it comes from, it's a reference to the philosopher Luce Irigaray, who was the kind of main theme of this whole conference. So the Luce Irigaray has written, it's a quotation from her saying that women diffuse themselves according to modalities scarcely compatible with the framework of the ruling symbolics. So it's a reference to kind of the idea of a patriarchal structure of the world that we all have to, in some way, fit ourselves into, and the kind of these incompatible modalities is a kind of celebration of these alternative modalities and an attempt to kind of temporarily create this garden with this space. And this event was documented in film and photography. There were postcards written during the lunch by Salon participants, which remain a trace of conversations and imaginations that took place. And I actually brought this. Here is this folder of these postcards that we have. Cannot see exactly what's written, but these postcards were then sort of written at the lunch hour as kind of greetings to each other, but also to the future. So there are some traces of this ephemeral event. But then again, we can ask ourselves what happened here. It was a long time ago now. It's like 21 years. No, it's 11 years soon. It was an ephemeral event. 2 hours passed as this Whirlwinds Day. Everyone returned then to further performances, exhibitions, talks. So in what way could this act of critical projection, in what way could this moment be saved, articulated, and affect the future? As to its effect, one may speak elaboratively on collective experience, shared memories, individual perceptions of different and in many cases kind of liberating encounters. These were undoubtedly created, and as such, for an individual participant, it also had a decisive impact. But to start as research to determine exactly what, or to measure its strength, it's not necessarily possible or even desirable. What I suggest is important is, however, a kind of continued remediation of these fictional spaces, the fictional moment as it appeared as reality, as if a reflection of the world as a garden where incompatible modalities belong. Taking care of research. Formalized methods are necessary to protect us from imposing what we think we already know on that which we seek freshly and more fully to understand. But the informal arts of being together that we also have are necessary to protect us against the thoughtlessness that trained technical and theoretical proficiency can lead to. By Elizabeth Camargue-Minnie, and I think it frames very clearly what I just spoke about. We have this event. How do we capture it? But how do we decide to capture it? We need to really reflect on documentation and the needs for documentation, but also to be very careful with it. So if we look at the Critical Studies Design Studio and the performance salon, such as the Incompatible Modalities Salon, in terms of design research, they are dependent on formats for documentation, critical analysis, and discussion in order to qualify properly as research through design. They constitute sites for knowledge production, and in the moment of performance, this is articulated, but there remains a surplus of work that needs to be undertaken to draw out the further research potential from these sites and situations. And this is, if we look at, we can look at publications that have come out of the Critical Studies Design Studio, the teachers, such as Brady Barrows, Katarina Bonnevier, Michael Schalk, and then also Hélène Frichot joined us. There are quite a lot of publications coming out that are also drawing on the design studio material. And we also had, as I would come in a little bit closer to the work that I did myself together with students on the Rosenlund Park, and this is what you see in the lower left, you see a little bit, which was a very direct engagement with an urban development project in Stockholm. Also, individual student projects in themselves carry through a design process from the production of design outcomes to the presentation of research outcomes that reach beyond the specific design. Especially, we have very interesting examples on the diploma level where the students themselves frame the research project. One example that I will go into in some length without the support of images, but that's Sarah Wall's diploma project from 2010. So in her thesis, she undertook a careful study of Slussen. It's a unique, it was, because now, 11 years later, this structure, which is very controversial if you know Stockholm. It's an urban node where the link between the southern parts of the inner city and the old town is connected. And it's been a building project that has been going on since for 30 years. Yes, for 30 years. The first competition was in 1991. But in 2010, the old infrastructural node still stood there. Now it does not. Now it's almost, there's a new construction. But what she did with this infrastructural node that was the first clover shaped, it's in the middle of the inner city. You have a kind of clover shaped transport. That was the first, was from 1930 or 1929, it was inaugurated. So a modernist traffic celebration, we can say, in the middle of Stockholm. Very controversial and provocative as such. What Sarah Wall did was that she was documenting this structure as an architectural object rather than as just an infrastructural node. And in this complex structure, you could find many different rooms. So she called her project 28 rooms. and used the architectural tools, the detailed drawings, and also the kind of programming description to catalog and describe what there was on the site. She entered with her investigation into this controversial debate that surrounded it since 30 years concerning what this place should be in the future. And she mapped Slussen, this node, as it is used and experienced, and in its actual factual manifestation. And few Stockholmers then actually knew that the concrete infrastructural node known as Slussen consisted of a great number of rooms, facilities that housed a diverse range of programs. And she mapped these with great precision and presented in architectural drawings these that had an almost anatomical character. The study aimed at developing tools for a more qualified discussion concerning the future of Slussen and presenting it in the form of catalog. The project then pointed to the potential of the site to become, already in its current form, this which actually now is completely destroyed, but then the potential of the site to become a lively meeting place, and the lively meeting place that in the rhetoric supporting the destruction was saying, if we tear this down, we can create this lively meeting place. And she was showing how the present construction could actually do all this work that was expected of the new. So this is an example of kind of where you use the architectural knowledge, your drawing methods, the program analytical skills of the architect to then also show alternatives and really enter a debate. So the questions could be asked with this catalog in hand: who has the power in planning? What tools are available for us that may influence the development of the city? And what consequences can information like what is provided in this catalog have? And after the completion of this project, I co-authored together with Sara Wall an article on this project and its further implications for urban design and planning practice. We also had, just to mention a few, diploma projects, both Jenny Andreas and Anja Linna, who developed in their work new innovative approaches to participatory mapping and altering practices of urban and rural spatial interventions. And I think a lot more can be done and more time should be invested into documentary, analytical, and reflective processing of performative research practices developed in studio settings. But at the same time, while saying this, I think it's also absolutely necessary to keep up the kind of tempo of the performative work, to kind of remain in action and not slow down through this documentary and analytical ambitions. So to continue to articulate spatially and materially the insights that we gain through educational and performative design practice. And I think this constitutes a complex balancing act for everyone involved. And the challenge that I think is also captured very well in this quotation that I began this section by, this by Minnie. On one hand, actually advocating for the formalist methods to protect us from imposing what we think we already know, but also the informal arts of being together. So I think this is important to remember. Okay, wedding theory to practice. Whether old or new, feminism remains an inherently positive approach. It insists not only on the necessity, but also on the possibility of change. Feminism weds theory to practice and encourages us to rethink the relationship between architecture schools and the larger professional world. Feminism's attention to practice fosters new ways of understanding and experimenting with process. In her article, Why Architects Need Feminism, Despina Stratigakos outlines the very concrete discriminatory practices that are still prevalent in the professional and educational world of architecture. As much as as FATALE, consciously choose to make explicit the feminist agenda of the group, rather than referring to gender studies more neutrally. Strategakos emphasizes a political imperative implicit in any feminist position. A very basic explanation of the notion of feminism clarifies that it entails two parts. One, an understanding that women on a structural level are disadvantaged in society, albeit in different ways, in different contexts. And second, the conviction that this situation ought to be changed. So while the first part is an arena for research on the situation, if there are these structural disadvantages, how do they look, how are they articulated, like how can we observe them, and so forth. That's a research question, aiming to further understand what is a matter of concern. But the second part is then the political arena. What are the means by which the situation at hand can be changed? And this too, of course, needs to be subjected to research. And different schools of feminism suggest different approaches. But the way of describing the notion in these two parts also clarifies the necessary link between theory and practice, as Strategakos writes. The insistence on the possibility for change and feminism's attention to practice. And the experience that we had of setting up the Critical Studies Design Studio and the FATALE Salon also confirmed the particular strength of feminism as a complex body of theories, practices, and activism, offering a way to work in which criticality aligns with concrete design work and performative action. So recent developments in theories and methodologies of participatory action research also emphasize a strong relation between feminist research approaches and action research. A link that, on the other hand, is argued to have long been underdeveloped or explicitly unrecognized within dominant discourses of action research. Originating as early as, sorry, I have to check one thing. No, sorry. I was just checking whether I was one image off, but I wasn't. Okay, so action research. Originating as early as 1946 with social psychologist Kurt Lewin, the field of action research has since developed to address a broad range of practice contexts in social research, from management to organization studies to nursing, education, architecture, planning, and design. And while action research in its broadest sense, by definition, share a commitment to transforming existing conditions in real settings, a particular strand of participatory action research sets out with the explicit aims towards empowerment and emancipation, that is, aiming to change political structures and power relations. And this responds directly then to the two intertwined aspects of feminism outlined above: the expanding knowledge and the taking action. And while contemporary theoretical and methodological references are abundant within a particular educational research, it is surprising to note how little discussed the relation between architectural design research and action research appears to be. There are some interesting examples of outlining these relations, but not so substantial. Transforming knowledge on site. How might we, as academic subjects, become open to possibility rather than limits on the possible? What would it mean to view thinking and writing as productive ontological interventions? How do we actually go about performing new economies? How can we participate in what is happening on the ground from an academic location, starting where we are to engender other worlds? In 2012, our studio engaged directly with participatory research, mapping, and interventions on a particular site in Stockholm, the Rosenlund Park in Södermalm. The western part of this park was then subjected to a planning process involving proposals for housing development and a new street cutting through the park. And as with Slussen, I can also tell that this site now is almost done with new housing development, and everything is done. So it's the site that we're talking about here does not exist anymore. The specific situation was highly conflictual, and it brought together a number of acute and principal questions concerning urban transformation, gentrification, sustainable development, planning politics, and ideologies. And at the heart of our concern, the absence of a situated local agency and actors. In the official planning process, they were completely absent as potential co-producers of knowledge on the existing site, of its history, and of its future instantiations. And I myself was precariously balancing here multiple positions in the project because I was both a lead researcher, I was a teacher, and I was also an engaged resident in the neighborhood. And this is then factored into the project as an asset rather than a problematic bias, but it is articulated clearly. And our engagement with this site built on previous research carried out by myself on performative modes of writing plays on the Rosenlund Park, and also my residential appropriation of this park as a kind of empirical ground and a position inside the research context. And theoretically, the project draw on feminist critiques of epistemology, in particular the notion of situated knowledges by Donna Haraway, Elizabeth Camac-Minnick's attention to philosophical fieldwork, and Rosie Braidotti's construction of the nomadic subject, but also on contemporary applications of these notions as demonstrated in the works of feminist economic geographers J.K. Gibson Graham and the project of belonging. And I don't know, is this getting too long? Like, are you are you getting exhausted now? Or I have like it's not so long. I think it's about 5 minutes or so. Will you bear
No problem.
with me?
Yeah. We are with you.
No okay, great. So just to say, Gibson Graham developed over the years a very specific action research practice based on active engagement in local communities, where they as researchers and representatives of the university sector constructed themselves as deeply entangled in concrete transformative processes with both local and global effects, and carefully mapping minor economies and local assets essentially overlooked by capitalist systems. Their methodology aimed to empower and activate what was below the tip of the iceberg. And this iceberg is a telling figure they have used to describe how small share of a total view of economies and resources for life that is counted as real economy from a capitalist viewpoint. So, transforming the world once again. To accomplish this, we are pushed to explore the unfamiliar and often uncomfortable landscape at the edge. It is uneven ground. There we get glimpses of how we might each further transform ourselves in action researchers engaged in transforming the world. From 2011, I was engaged as director in building up a national strong research environment for the development of theories and methodologies for architectural engagement in societal concerns, architecture in effect. The research and teaching practices developed within the context of FATALE and with critical studies in architecture that was described here also became then part of a larger context in which political and social concerns were specifically foregrounded. And these strong research environments that were formed was part of a research funding initiative taken by one of the larger state funding research bodies, FORMAS, with a specific aim to then strengthen architectural research in Sweden. So we were 4 schools of architecture that we are in Sweden, only 4. We went together and formulated 2 strong research environments and also a research school, which we received a kind of long-term funding for. And KTH, with me as director, was hosting one of these, which was called Architecture in Effect, Rethinking the Social in Architecture. And the other, a strong research environment, which was hosted by Chalmers in Gothenburg, was called Architecture in the Making. And it was focusing more on, let's say, the production aspects of architecture. But researchers were really also going in and out of these environments. So in some way we captured through these two environments, like two different important aspects of architectural research. And we also had the opportunity to develop together then a research school. So now this funding is over. These environments have developed into other things, but we do still have a very strong collaboration on the research school, and a lot of things happen as a result of this. So there were over 40 research projects that were going on within architecture in effect on rethinking the social in architecture. We developed along the way, we developed conferences, symposias, readers, and we did, in the end, we did produce this, and I like it. It's very heavy, this Architecture in Effect, 2-volume publication. It came out last year, but as you know, like these publications take a very, very long time to come out. So it sort of came out in 2017, but then it took even longer to really come into the world. And it has a wide range of research and design practices going on. It constitutes very concrete actions of making change, physical, social, mental, in space for community support and creation. And B, critical conceptualizations of these practices, theorizing, questioning, positioning actions and responsibilities. And C, scrutinizing that which is happening anyway today in local and global contexts. What is at stake? And we asked ourselves in these discussions, what then is the role of our theoretizations here? Do we need critical theory or philosophy to make change happen? With that question, we also can return to the questions posed at the beginning of this chapter. What is at stake when not only design, but design research engages in the transformation of the world? And that further works from a socially engaged and emancipatory position. If we, with design research here, agree that we imply research through and into rather than for, it appears necessary to always find or construct theoretical or philosophical positions from which to view and make sense of the action that one performs through a design research process. Exactly how and with recourse to exactly what conceptualizations or frameworks these constructions are articulated, one cannot say, but they are needed in order to retain a criticality and a reflexivity. And it is in these locations that knowledge takes shape and from where it migrates to other specific sites, practices, concerns, or communities. It is what secures that action in reality also transforms discourse. So with that, I want to say thank you. And I also want to say, so this lecture is based on the book chapter, Design Research and Critical Transformations, in this volume. And I brought some books. So this is Design Research and Architecture, a volume that you might have seen, edited by Mary Fraser. And also the research on the Rosenlund Park that I mentioned is also then based on these two essays here. So if I share my presentation later with Basak, you can get this, these references. And I really want to thank the material produced here. It's also thanks to my fantastic colleagues and students in FATALE and Critical Studies in Architecture at KTH, also to this environment that I told you about, the architecture and effect environment. And then thanks to the Swedish Research Council Formas, which made all that, research formations possible. So thank you so much. I will stop sharing. So.
Thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. So maybe we can ask our guests if they have any questions.
Yeah.
Maybe I can start. It always takes time to ask the first question, so yeah, I will start. When you were, first of all, thank you very much, and it was very interesting because I was expecting to question myself regarding what research is, but more than that, I found myself getting really excited to think about these critical capacity of research mixed with happening like events and almost like an activist cause being used for an activist cause and having a voice of some kind. And when you were in one of your last slides, you were showing the images from the Strong Research Environments in Architecture conference. I saw the book cover of Spiro Kostos, the architect, in the background. And that made me realize more than anything, I think, your work and the idea of design research and performative practices is a means to re-question and reformulate. Who is an architect? What is the role of an architect? And I'm quite excited about this question as well. This is not a new question, I know, and there are many alternative ways of trials that people are trying to put forward and in a way rebel against what we started calling in our class the establishment. And you can understand what I mean when I use the word the establishment in reference to architectural community. It's the typical architectural office environment, and what does an architect do, etc., in relation to those questions. So even though it's not a very easy question, my question to you is, how do you define an architect?
Yeah, I think you already you introduced the complexity of the question. Yes. Like, I mean, this question, it's almost, I mean, one way of, like, there are different ways of thinking about it. Like, yes, okay, an architect might actually have a training as an architect and then go out into the world to do lots of different stuff with this knowledge. So yeah, you can define it by an idea of a certain kind of body of knowledge that you then go out into the world and do different things with. As contrasting to the idea of an architect is someone who actually designs buildings, or the kind of narrow idea. We did this together with my colleagues Tim Anstey and Rolf Hughes. I co-edited, we had a research project on architecture and authorship, and we co-edited the book on this. And in that we kind of really explore the history of this question of architectural authorship, which then is also like what is kind of defining an architect or the architect. All the complexities from a kind of architecture without architects, that discourse, which would then say, no, an architect is not someone who has an architectural education. That's a very kind of institutional definition. An architect might be someone who is actually showing a proficiency in design of buildings by actually performing it. And so I am a little bit stressed now because I see that the contact that I'm connecting my computer with is actually not loading. So I just need to change contacts. So bear with me.
No problem.
Finding another contact.
Okay.
I don't know if it's just socket. That's a kind of typical thing. Now we are completely depending on. It's not just the projection going down. So
that's true. It's a whole new world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I remember the times that our only worry were the slide carousels and stuff. And
Exactly. Yeah, the slide carousel.
it's
That was
a whole
kind of
different thing now.
the lamp.
Yeah.
So yes, it's charging now. So okay, we're safe.
Good.
Yeah. No, but it's I mean, I also, I mean, one of the books that I think was important to me when starting to look into more the question of architecture and gender is Francesca Yu's book, The Architect Reconstructing Her Practice, where she had invited then notable women architects. Like it was Jennifer Blumer, Beatrice Colomina, was Dagmar Richter, was a range of architects that were asked to contribute with essays where they articulated their practice as architects. So the responses then became as different as their practices, from the more writing, researching practices to the design, the design project, to the experimental, theoretical, and really showing the kind of range of what can be an architect. So no, I didn't answer your question, but maybe expanded on it. And the actual session where you saw the Kostov image, that was one of the program areas we had within the research environment, was called Architects Information, and was then discussing the history of architectural education and the kind of formation of and challenges to the ideas of the architects.
I see. Thank you very much. I mean, I didn't really want to put you on spot like that. When I was asking the question, clearly I didn't want you to just give us a formula like this.
No, of course not. Of course not.
Yeah, of course not. So, but what your work does at the end, I shouldn't say at the end, but part of what your work also suggests is this revision of the conservative ideas regarding who an architect is and what are the contributions of an architect. And this was very strong in your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
Sevinci?
Hi, thank you for this very inspiring presentation. I think I'm going to ask a little bit more personal question based on the quote that you shared from Elizabeth Camargue about this, to protect us from imposing what we think we already know. So I think it's the environment we are already in. I don't know how it is in your institution, but both the architecture design studio or the academy, in total, it's a place that it's the biggest obstacle in front of the research is the feeling of that, okay, we already know that. So I think that's the main, one of the main things that we need to be checking on ourselves as well. So I was planning to ask, do you really find yourself, in that position at some time, or, okay, did I lose that? Or, trying to impose what you already know? Or is it, can you just really keep it all the time, taking care of the research? Or do you have that kind of difficulties or ups and downs?
Yeah, that's a really good question of how you kind of navigate in these institutional settings. And that's how I understand your question, that there's kind of institutional setting that in somehow wants to fix things and wants to kind of say, oh, we already know that. Yeah, and how you kind of keep questioning and find the room to keep questioning. Yeah, I think it's like to kind of to recognize it, and then to I mean, it's also interesting, as you know, I was presented here. I'm also currently the head of department, so I have to kind of keep things in order, to things to work, and the planning for the next year. And then you might also get into this danger of a kind of, oh, it's easier to just fix certain positions. But I think there are ways in which to kind of nurture an atmosphere where we are always have the energy to ask the questions, to dare to show students that things can be otherwise, and so I think it is not easy, but it is like a question of also what kind of conversational climate do you have? Can we agree to temporarily believe this to be true, but we understand that it's temporarily, and so forth? So how can we kind of be then? And that's also what I think this pragmatic action perspective is also giving you, that, well, we need to agree on some things in order to get further. So can we agree in a way that doesn't lock us down forever? Then I think like I kind of at least try to maintain this open an open attitude, and to kind of nurture that and encourage that in both students and among colleagues, and so I would aspire to it, but I cannot say that it's always easy or working. It's a very good question. I think.
Thank you very much. You already defined a very dynamic formula. I mean, for me, I'm really happy to hear that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any more questions or comments?
I love this temporarily believing thing. Temporarily believing. I mean, I'm kind of.
That's great. Okay. Thank you. It's getting dark here because I have to kind of stand up and wave a little. Yes, now it's lighter again. Okay.
I guess there are no more questions. Well, maybe we can conclude then our session.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Oh, Murat, do you have a question? Okay, last minute question.
For your workshop about the interstitial breakfast, how can we position that workshop according to this presentation, or according to this the design, research, and architecture?
You mean this incompatible modality salon, the kind of lunch hour performance that we did? Yes. I mean, in some ways, so that is like we can. I mean, what it does is that it's a spatial performative design practice. So we set up in these gallery spaces, we set up through a spatial arrangement, we set up these different follies, then drawing on kind of garden tradition of follies. And these follies would have, if you're familiar with like 18th century gardening, like these follies would have different themes. They would be the grotto, love nest. So they also would have almost like mythical themes to them. So it was like, in some way, it's a spatial design practice by setting up this. But then we also performed a narrative by doing a guided tour in that. So that would also give yet another kind of layer of significance to the space. And the participants were invited to then to take place, to be in this fictional garden. So in some way, the whole project is like a design, a spatial, temporary design project, which allows you to, but being also engaging then in these conversations around taking place within this conference setting, larger exploration. It's sort of inviting a whole conversational and thought development. So the question of like how it's cited within architecture and design research, like it is in itself a kind of example of a design research experiment. And what I was talking about was also ideas and reflections on how this is documented, how this is analyzed, how much one can do with it, what it does in some way. So in some way, in the context of this lecture, it is like an example of a design research intervention that one can do also a lot more about. I don't know if that manages to answer your question a little.
Yes, actually, I wonder the importance of the breakfast part of for this workshop, for that workshop.
Yeah, okay, the more like the actual eating. Yeah.
Yes.
yeah. No, I mean, that's
part.
also that's a super interesting question. I mean, that's also the idea of, in some way, it's the idea of like being somewhere, not only to look at it, so to kind of be observing, to be a kind of spectator of a place, but to be practicing the place. So the role of the lunch, we can say, the role of the soup that was being served and of the tables is also to make sure that we are like practicing this place that has been set up so temporarily and for this hour. So yes, so the food has a very explicit role of bringing us there, embodied, let's say. Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can ask one more question. The examples that we have seen in your presentation were more like, let's say, ephemeral pieces or works. What do you think about that performativity of the architecture and the temporal level of it? Because does it have to be something in change itself, or does it present it better?
No, I don't. I think we can discuss it on many different levels. So I mean, for example, I mean, if we take, okay, let's say take for example this case, this Slussen, the infrastructure node that I talked about, and the cataloging of that. That cataloging and the documentation that was produced in some way is like artifact, like it's not temporary. It's like it's like an anatomical map of that place. It kind of preserves in this medium. It's like preserves this structure, and it is as a catalog. It's permanent, even though the structure was torn down. So I wouldn't say that is like any. I mean, as much as this catalog is, and the drawings are like they're fixed. Of course, a kind of building when it's built is there and can do a lot of different things. But I guess with if we take the concept of situated knowledges that we have used a lot by Donna Haraway, one needs to look at everything, even if it's like permanent in some way. You need to look at it in terms of its situation and situatedness. In what context are we addressing this, in what context is this making sense to us, and it can make different sense in different times, and one can analyze it in different ways. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but it's the temporality as such of the event or so is not necessarily the case. I would say in lots of, like, if design research projects, if design projects are also the potentially articulations of research, it is not it doesn't need to be temporary in any way. It can be completely built and standing, and but then it's like how it is addressed, what questions are we asking, what are we bringing out of it, is maybe the most important.
Yeah, it is opening up all new questions in mind when we are discussing that in a performative way and in your presentation. So I was just curious about your comments on it. Okay.
Okay. I will wave again. Now it's like, I think we were lucky. It probably starts like after 7, that the light closes down all the time. Okay.
Very nice. It's giving us a warning.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's all right. Do we have any more comments?
I will send you, Rosak, I will send you the presentation, and then you can share with.
Okay, I can share it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so write to Basak if you're interested to hear more.
Sure. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for the presentation, and it was a pleasure to listen to you. So thanks all the guests for their presence and their comments.
Yes, and we hope that we can have you host you in Istanbul next time.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Yeah, that would be fantastic. And good luck with all the work, both in the long run, but also like in short term now in this end of term, with all the projects that I guess are being finalized in these strange distance conditions that we are going through right now. So good luck with everything.
Likewise. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. YouTube yayınını da sonlandırabiliyoruz sanırım. O zaman kapatıyoruz.
Meeting'i sonlandırıyoruz, evet.
Tamam.
Görüşmek üzere.
Görüşürüz. Teşekkürler.